Thanks, guys. That was really interesting. Switching tack a little bit now, we're going to talk a little bit about brand building and creative effectiveness. My name is Anna Dunn. I'm a global account director at a company called Zappi. Zappi is a market research platform where some of the biggest brands in the world test their advertising and innovation ideas at scale. I'm joined here by Chris Gough, who is brand director at Three. Chris, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Chris. I'm head of marketing communications at Three. My normal role, I joined Three about 4 or 5 years ago. My normal role is everything from brand strategy to creative media, PR, social. Since January, I've actually been working on, you'll have probably seen the news over the weekend that my new employer is now Vodafone Three, not just Three. So we've gone through a merger at the weekend. I've actually been since January working on that and working on our future brand strategy, but I can't talk about that, so we won't talk about that. We'll just focus on the past.
Fair enough. So we're gonna, before we get into talking specifically about Three, and we're gonna show a piece of advertising from a recent campaign, so you can understand practically a little bit about some of the points Chris is making. But before we go into that, it'd be great if you could just talk a little bit about your perspective on brand building and how that's evolved over the last few years, where we've seen a lot of change.
Yeah, loads of change. I think it's a really, really interesting time. I think we were chatting a bit when we caught up this morning. I think, the industry's been through huge change over the last 15 years, driven by technology, which has changed the way that consumers obviously interact with brands, and changed the way that you therefore need to build brands. And I think that's had a couple of consequences over the last few years. I think number one, it means that quite rightly brands have leaned into digital, social, etc. to build their brand. I think that often the perception though was that if I go back to when I was in agencies years ago, I think there was a bit of a narrative that maybe brands would become less important because of that technology. And actually what we've seen over the last few years is that brands are more important than ever before. So, there was a really interesting Brand Z report recently that talked about, the Brand Z set of brands versus the S&P 500 and looked at their growth over the last 20 years and, massively outstrips that S&P 500. So brand has become more important. The way that marketers have been using their tool at their disposal has changed hugely. I think that has meant that sometimes for some brands, it means that we've started to shift a little bit more into promotion rather than persuasion. And I think there's been a bit of a change there that maybe with the research that's now out there around the importance of brand might start to shift back. And I also think that a lot of marketing people have probably shifted into that world of promotion rather than persuasion and a long-term brand. But looking forward to the future, I think that the future is bright and that there's so much research out there now, so much training available for our teams, that I hope that with the coming tsunami of AI conversations, we don't lose track of that we are here fundamentally as marketers to build brands for the long term, and that we are here to persuade and not just promote.
Makes sense. And on that, about kind of persuading the consumer, that makes a lot of sense. But what about persuading internally? How do you kind of balance the investment in that longer term brand building with the undoubtedly kind of constant pressure on ROI and showing impact in the short term to the rest of the busin's?
It can be tough, can't it?
I know.
We work in incredibly commercial business, as lots of people here will. I previously was at Samsung, who were, you were literally looking at the numbers of phones being activated every day. It was that level of detail, and it's very hard, I think, sometimes in those environments to talk about the long term. I think that as a marketing director, it's your job to often educate the board. That can be tough. There's loads of great research out there, and we all are aware of different studies that have been done. It's very hard sometimes to take that and put that in front of a CFO or a sales director, because they kind of might look at it and just go, yeah, but it's just theory, right? So it can be really tough. I think you can, certainly if you've got, as we are, we're a big brand, we've got loads of our own research. You can use your own econometrics and stuff to tell that longer term story sometimes. But I think it also comes down to, and I often talk to my team about this, which often comes down to the language that you use. So you can try and educate. Sometimes that door's not open. But I think the language that you use, and the language we use as marketing people, is super important. I've talked in the past at events like this about, performance marketing, and, the fact that I think that is a term that doesn't help us as an industry. It tends to, people outside of marketing look at that and go, that's the bit that performs for me. All that other stuff is just that kind of fluffy bit, which is absolutely not right. And I also think we need to get better sometimes at just putting marketing into terms that a CFO will care about, right? And I think, linking things obviously back, if you can, to financial performance. I always find that loss aversion is a good way to operate with CFOs. I think if you talk about the fact that, by not doing this, we're going to lose out on X million next year, that can be quite persuasive as well. So I think lots of different techniques that you can use to try and make that case for longer term investment. I actually think as well, that's another problem. I was chatting to somebody about this the other day, long and the short of it, and we talk about long term investment. It's kind of not right. It's lasting investment. It's talk about that instead. It's stuff that acts now, but will have a lasting impact on the brand going forward.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And thinking about that sort of lasting investment, and specifically around your time at 3, can you give us some examples or some insight into kind of successes that you've seen at 3 with this sort of approach to brand building?
Yeah, of course. Yes. So we took a look at our brand back in 2020, 2021. 3, for those of you who don't know, 3 was launched in 2003, 3rd of March, 03. If you remember it, very clever, good piece of marketing there. They were the first 3G mobile operator in the UK, for those of you who remember 3G. So the first, one talking about that. And we grew massively, right? So we had a huge success from 2003 all the way through to 2020. We had 17, 18 years of massive growth. We positioned ourselves very much as a challenger brand. We operated in the early years of things like meme culture, social, etc., and built our brand in that way. We were very youth. We were quite, as far as mobile brands go, relatively cool. And had some great advertising campaigns. People remember things like the Dancing Pony, maybe, and stuff like that. Yeah, we had brilliant campaigns. The trouble was we sort of ran out of road with that strategy. We were appealing to a specific group of people. We were looking at research at the time that basically said, I mean, the irony of saying this in this room, right? You're too advertising, you're too Shoreditch, was basically the feedback that we were getting from the broader population. And we weren't reaching a broad enough audience. We weren't able to talk about a broad enough range of products. So we had to make a change, and we realised we had some massive headwinds as well coming our way. There was a massive growth in the competition. So mobile virtual networks, as they call them, so those are the operators that don't own the masts and the infrastructure, like Gough, for example. Over the previous decade, 150 of those had launched. So the competition set had grown massively. And we recognised that actually what had happened, although we'd been quite cool and edgy and youth, we'd been massively inconsistent. Our brand was, if you laid it all out as we did on a wall, it looked like a different brand in every place. So it was a bit all over the shop. So we took a fresh look at it. We launched a new brand platform, which was Life Needs a Big Network. That was there to address some of the network perceptions that we had at the time. People felt that our network wasn't as strong as some of the others. And we doubled down on things like consistency. which has, again been something that's been talked about quite a lot recently. System One did a really good bit of work looking at how, being consistent as a brand can really pay off over the long term. And we introduced various new campaigns. We went into new areas of sponsorship, which were much broader, things like football. And over the last 4 or 5 years, that's really paid back for us. So, all of our, brand measures that the CFO won't care about, all of our brand measures have increased, and our association with things like Better Network has increased. But we were also able to demonstrate through econometrics and a bit of science, and we've just won a FE and an IPA effectiveness award on the back of this work, that actually we were able to increase the impact of our media spend as a result. And actually, when you look at the numbers, it basically means that all the money that we spent on media since about 2020 has almost been free. It's paid. It's because it's almost doubled the impact of that media investment.
Sort of thing that makes the CFO happy.
Makes them happy for a bit. Yeah.
For everything. As happy as they get.
Yeah.
And do you look at any other measures of kind of creative effectiveness? Are there any other things that you look at? Are you looking at shifts in kind of consumer behaviour change as well? How do you evaluate that?
Yeah. So we do. We do some quite traditional stuff. So the bigger broadcast campaigns, we run creative testing and have a look at, how they are resonating with people and that kind of thing. And we, certainly lean into some measures like, do people get that it's our brand because it's such a competitive category and all that kind of stuff. We also test stuff as we go. I think that's fine for broadcast, but when you're operating in culture, slightly different. So if you're in social, or if we're talking about football sponsorship or events or music festivals that are in, we use things like social listening to try and get a gauge of what the impact of that activity is. So a little bit of sort of traditional science, a little bit of slightly more modern thinking as well, and I think also just using your gut as well. I think sometimes you might choose to show that research or not, depending on how you feel about it. But I think you have to use your gut a bit as well.
I've definitely been on the receiving end of that as a researcher sometimes. What we've got now to show you is an execution from a recent campaign that Three ran, and then we thought it would be nice to use that as an example to talk a little bit more about creative effectiveness and how the consumer played a role. Something I can definitely relate to from a few years back.
Yeah, me last night.
Yeah. Just thinking a little bit more about how you developed that campaign and kind of the role of consumer feedback or customer feedback, I guess. How did you develop that? What role did the consumer play as that went along?
So I guess there's a couple of stages to it that we tend to go through. There's very much a strategy stage. So the whole this is one execution of a massive campaign, and I'm always conscious of showing sort of TV ads in things like this because it's obviously not just about a single TV ad. This was part of a much wider campaign that went across all media channels, and in every channel we were in, there was it was a different execution. It wasn't all just about a Midnight Mums Club. It was also about on TV an interview and other things in other channels, but all bound together by this strategic idea of belonging and the idea that there's no more feeling more powerful than belonging to a connected network, right? That was the strategic starting point. So we involve consumers in that first stage. So we get to a few starting points like that and run that through groups to see what resonates, see what feels true to us as a brand based on consumer feedback. And at that point, a number of ideas will drop by the wayside. And we usually then proceed with one or two strategic ideas into creative development. I much prefer doing it just with one, and that's what we did this time. Is we just chose one and went with that rather than going with two. We then also involved consumers as well in the development of the script and the idea and fleshing out the particular execution. So in this case, Midnight Mums Club was the idea was real. So the idea came from somebody. It was a producer at Wonderhood, who our creative agency had a WhatsApp group called Midnight Mums Club, so it was a real thing. We actually went off and recruited a group of mums, of real mums. We referred to them as the motherboard, which we thought was very funny at the time. We went and did ethnographic research with them. We actually went to their houses and saw the environment they were living in, what that looked like. I mean, I've got two quite young children at the moment, so I'm aware that my house is normally covered with Tommy Tippy bottles and washing and baby grows and bibs up the stairs and all that kind of stuff, right? But we went out there and saw how these mums were living, and also bounced ideas off them and talked them through ideas that we had as well. In the case of that particular ad, for example, the lady who talks about her baby only sleeping to techno music was one of our motherboard women who told us that her baby only sleeps to techno. So I don't know what their nights are like. You know, and also, you know, it helped as well. There are certain scenes in there which have kind of been dialed back a bit because of internal pressure. Which I think I can talk about now because we've gone through merger and I've got different bosses. You know, but sometimes people feel uncomfortable about certain things in advertising, right? So there's a scene in there. If you were to watch it again, there's actually one of the women's got, it's supposed to be frozen cabbage leaves down her top, because if you're a bit sore, then that is something that helps. There are people nodding. There was going to be a bit more made of that in the ad. We had to dial it back, but we were still able to keep the cabbage leaves in the ad for those people who got it, because the motherboard said, actually, you know what, that resonates really well. That works. So yeah, at different stages.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And then how, towards the end of the process, how do you know that the ad's kind of ready to go out in the world? What kind of, I mean, I'm sure you're nervous, but what kind of gives you the confidence that it will land, or certainly for this campaign, maybe? Yeah,
you sort of build an intuition, I think, right? I think anyone who's sort of on the receiving end as a client of this kind of stuff, you build an intuition. I think for me, I always feel really, really uncomfortable all the way through until we get the music. So sometimes, often when we've done this, the music comes a little bit later. Yeah. And I think as soon as we find a track, if there is a track on the ad, as there has been in most of our stuff over the last few years, it works well from an advertising point of view. You know, as soon as we got Bill Withers' Lean on Me, I was like, okay, that's it, great, get it. Yeah. And we used the same track on a few ads, and it worked for all of them. And it's like, yeah, that's great, get it. So at that point, I start to breathe a little bit easier and feel a little bit more comfortable. And then you've just got to trust your gut and let it go out in the world, right?
Yeah. Let your baby go.
Yeah.
And I guess some of it sounds like consumer feedback was important, yeah, and it really helped and actually kind of built a lot of the detail of that campaign. But I think one of the challenges that I certainly see on the sort of research supplier side, and I think will become more of an issue as AI becomes more of a data stream and an input. How do you sort of avoid the risk of falling into formulaic creative and while still being data informed? Like, what's the balance there?
Yeah,
tough question.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's it can be difficult. I think you've got to be really careful with the how you listen to the research. So we do research on the create. So we do the research I've just talked about with consumers. In terms of actual ad testing, for example, I personally don't ad test until the ad's out. So I do it, but it doesn't change anything in the ad, because you always get in traditional ad testing, so like Ipsos Spark or whatever it is you're using, you'll often get back the same commentary, which is needs a logo up front, we all all that kind of stuff, and the trouble is if you follow all of that advice, you can end up with something that's a bit formulaic. So I think the answer is that you've got to go with your gut, go your instinct. I think you have to be quite tapped into the advertising industry and culture just to understand what might resonate. But I think if you start trying to tick too many boxes of we must do this, we must have this, we must do that, that's when it becomes too formulaic and can be detrimental.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Any questions to round off our session?
Thank you. Hi, Chris. So I'm Vishal. I'm from PwC, and we've recently gone through our own kind of brand refresh, and trying to take the brand into a more bold direction. I was just curious how you kind of build internally a culture on creative effectiveness and this understanding across your team of how do you give people space and deal with that uncertainty that you kind of need for creativity, but also the effectiveness mindset.
Yeah. So I think for me anyway, it always comes back to what's the strategy. So what's your marketing strategy? What's your brand strategy? So that people can then be enabled to go away and operate within that framework, right? I think what you don't want to create is a culture where absolutely everything has to come to you, or where people feel constrained that they have to create something in a certain way. I think the beauty of big brands like Three is that they can show up in different ways to different people, but that should be within a framework of a strategy. And I think if you're able to articulate, we always do a strategy session to kick off the year with our teams so that they understand their specific bit of what they're doing in marketing, whether that be customer comms or sponsorship or events or TV advertising, that they understand how they fit into that wider strategy and therefore what are the things that I should be aiming for. So I think that's really important. And then I think also just working with our agencies, working with media partners as well, actually, to bring in outside inspiration is really important. I think having that outward, we're terrible sometimes in market. I came from an agency background where you're working across multiple brands all the time. So you're always looking outward. I think as soon as you find yourself in a brand, sometimes there's a danger that you become quite inward focused and you just think about mobile networks and Three, and that's just not the world in which any of this stuff is consumed. As Rob said earlier, people have got other stuff on their mind. They're not thinking about mobile networks hardly ever, actually, unless it's not working. So it's really important to bring that outside mindset into brands, I believe.
Sorry, all the way in the back. I really like that approach that you talked about for creative to be too formulaic and just make sure it's a bit different and maybe cuts through. How do you bring that mindset to the media plan? Because I feel like media plans can very often include the same 10 partners, executions, and obviously you also talk about culture. So I'd love to hear if you have any examples on that.
Yeah. So I used to work at media agencies back in the day. I think that I think as an industry, sometimes media agencies are a little bit constrained by the fact that they have to demonstrate an ROI, or they feel that they have to very much follow what the numbers say. And I think you need to, as a brand, give your agency the freedom to move away from that. I've certainly had it where I felt in the past that I've briefed something in a certain way, and then what I get back is a plan which is, okay, we're going to do all these things which we did last year because we know they work. And you kind of go, yeah, but great, but where's the innovation? Where's the new thinking? So I think you have to create an environment where the agency understand that that's expected of them and they can come back with that. We often do it as a separate session, maybe at the beginning of the year of agencies, to kind of go, actually, you know what, let's try and identify certain areas within our broader marketing plan where we think there's an opportunity for innovation. So, for us, that might be taking an element of our plan, like, I don't know, for example, our rewards app 3+, and going, actually, maybe there's something there that we could do with media partners, and we sometimes go and create separate briefs almost to get some more innovative media thinking back. But I think it's difficult. I think it's difficult for media agencies. I kind of feel for media agencies sometimes that you're kind of hit with both sticks of, well, you need a plan that's efficient, but you also want innovation, and that can be a really difficult balance for agencies to get right. So you've just got to give them permission to get it wrong occasionally.
I think just to touch on the point again that you made about creative composition and not being super templated, I guess a lot of marketers that I hear from, they say that it's trying to find that sweet spot of the creative composition itself, what that looks like, how rigid it is, but then also understand how that's actually impacting campaign performance. So I guess my question to you is, having done such great work in the space, like how do your team go about identifying what those different creative elements or components are within the assets and pinpointing with data just how much of an impact each of those are having? I guess, with the mindset of going into your next campaign knowing these are the different components that will contribute best towards success.
Yeah, really good question. Research. So like I say, we research. I don't pre-test, post-test. And then when you've post-tested, it means that you can go away as a team and really analyse that without the pressure of having to suddenly change something on it as you're going. So that can help. And we also look at what the elements as a brand are that we want to include in most of the things that we do. And we have lots of conversations before we brief an agency on something like a brand ad, as this was. We have lots of conversations about how we want to develop those individual elements. And that's everything from colour palette in an ad. Again, if you were to watch that again, it's got slight... our brand colour is called Aurora Sunrise, for those of you who... It's orange. But Aurora Sunrise, so we make sure, so we look at the grading of the ad to make sure that that's reflected. We look at things like the type of music choice. We talk a lot about things like, as a brand for us, things like sense of humour is really important and getting that balance right. In that particular ad that you saw, it was really important to us that it felt, although it starts with a crying baby, and you need to show that journey of somebody who's actually, crying and is really upset, it also needs to be quite uplifting. There needed to be a sense of humour in it. So we talk a lot about that and use other advertising as inspiration sometimes to land on what is specifically our sense of humour. How do we want to use things like colour? How do we want to use end frames? So there's quite a lot of technical thinking that we do before we brief a campaign, but none of that should be done to constrain ideas and thinking.
How about placement? Because that plays a very important and very determinant role. So don't you feel that after it is on air, you kind of lost control and you're just praying that it will be rightly placed and reaching the right audience? And how do you control or try to control that?
You're talking here about media placement. Yeah, we think a lot about it. It's we work with Zenith, who will come back with a plan, and for each campaign there are nuances within that. So we have broad media principles that we try to adhere to at overall campaign level. When it comes down to specific executions, like the one you've just seen, there is then more nuance layered into it. So as an example, we played this ad out at midnight, unsurprisingly. We also tapped into things like mum and baby cinema clubs, which often, for those of you who've got young kids, if you want to go to the cinema at 6 o'clock in the morning with a 1-year-old, then knock yourself out. But we went into that sort of environment as well. So the agency will layer in that more nuanced thinking.
Fantastic. Give it up for Anna and Chris. Thank you.